Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for Expel Detection Day. I'm Dan Whalen. I'm on the Expel Detection Response Engineering team. And today, in this session, we're going to talk about detection in your cloud infrastructure. Let me get my window shared here. All right. So in this session, we're going to start off by talking about how detection in your cloud infrastructure is a little bit different from what you might expect on-prem infrastructure. We're also going to get into how we can approach that problem. We'll talk a little bit about how to put this in practice by going through a detection strategy exercise. And we'll follow up with some lessons we've learned at Expel about how to build detection strategies in cloud infrastructure. We'll talk specifically today about Azure, but keep in mind that all of these concepts can be applied to any cloud provider, whether that's Azure, AWS, or even GCP. My hope is today that we leave you after the session with a methodology that you can apply to your own environment to build out your own detection strategies. Now, let's start off by talking about what makes detection in cloud infrastructure different. As a member of our Expel's detection and response team, we found that building out a detection strategy in the cloud is a little bit different from what you might expect from on-prem infrastructure. Let's dig into why that is. Now, you've likely all seen or you're familiar with a diagram or a chart that looks something like this. This is the shared responsibility matrix for Azure. And this is one of the main selling points, as a customer of cloud infrastructure, right? One of the selling points is, as a customer, you're responsible for less. And this is absolutely true. So if you look at the bottom, of this chart on the right, that gray area, what this is saying is, as a customer of cloud infrastructure, you're not responsible for example, physical security of Azure data centers. You're not responsible for network switches or swapping hard drives or anything like that. So certainly true that you're responsible for less, but one of the dimensions that I think is often missed in these responsibility matrices is the fact that the responsibility actually changes between on-prem and infrastructure as a service. So what it means to be responsible as a customer, for example, identity and access management, is slightly different. It actually changes versus infrastructure as a service, so in Azure. Now, let's dig into why exactly that is. So if we look at the technology stack for a cloud platform like Azure, it looks something like this at a high level, right? At the bottom and the top of this stack, you have things that look very familiar to you. You've got resources all the way at the bottom, things we're very familiar with, whether that's CPU, network, memory, or storage, stuff that's very similar to what we're used to on-prem. And at the top of the stack, we've got stuff we're familiar with as well. Our applications that we've built and are running, whether that's our front-end website or data pipeline, our code base, stuff we're all familiar with and know how to deal with. But it's this glue in the middle that's different and new. And this represents, fundamentally new technology that we have to get used to as defenders and understand how to defend. So, for example, in Azure, in every cloud platform, there's a cloud control plane layer that essentially figures out how to resource everything that you're requesting. And there's these services that live on top of that control plane, whether that's Azure AD, or Azure database services. These are fundamentally new technologies. As defenders, we have to get used to. They have a different look and feel to what we're used to on-prem. And as a result, there's different security risks that we have to understand. Now, that can be a little bit of a challenge for organizations that are either moving to the cloud or starting anew in the cloud when it comes to securing that infrastructure. It can be a little bit of a problem that's hard to approach. So how do we make this a bit of an easier problem to decompose? At Expel, we found mental models like this one to be helpful. We think of a mental model as a way of breaking down like a big complex problem into smaller parts that help you organize and start to approach the problem. And here's what a loose mental model for building a detection strategy looks like based on our experience. So we would recommend that you always start with understanding your environment. What sort of services are you using? What sort of data do you have? What sort of users do you have? And how do those system interactions work? And secondly, as a defender, it's really important to understand what's going on in the threat landscape. Understand what sort of risks exist for your industry. So if you're in the financial industry, what sort of risks or threats should you be worried about? Talk to your peers and get an understanding of what sort of things you should prioritize in terms of threats. And both of those things can feed into step 3 here, which is really identifying and prioritizing your unique areas of risk. There's a huge amount of things you could go out as a defender and really prioritize or build out as part of your detection strategy. But this prioritization step is really, really important. So you're focusing on the things that are most important to you. You get the best bang for your buck. And those priorities, those areas of risk, those will feed into your detection engineering process. So how do you actually build a detection strategy around those areas of risk to surface up alerts to the right people at the right time to help you identify and respond to threats in your environment? And those alerts, of course, will feed into your incident handling process in front of your analysts to make sure that your analysts have the right visibility, the right notifications, and can respond when there is actually an issue in your environment. And one key thing about this mental model or this detection engineering process, it's not a one and done process. This is a continual cycle of feedback. And that's a really important thing to understand and plan for from the get-go. You know, your business is constantly changing as you're growing, as you have new requirements. You know, the threat landscape is constantly changing as well. As new risks and threats emerge, we have to be willing to adapt and change and you know, adjust our detection strategy to compensate for those new risks and those new threats. So this entire system is changing, and we want to make sure that we're compensating for that from the get-go as part of this process. Now, again, it can be a bit of a challenge as a defender to really approach this, right? You know, if you're a defender and you're tasked with defending your cloud infrastructure in Azure, it can be hard to understand where to begin. We've had these sorts of conversations with our customers at Expel time and time again. And in doing this, you know, we've come up with a process that has worked for us, helps us to quickly understand the risks that exist in a new environment, help us to quickly learn about that environment, and build a detection strategy that makes sense. And I don't know about you all, I certainly love a good acronym, and I'll you know, try to create one at every opportunity. So we've got an acronym here to help us, to guide us through this process, and we'll call it Ask Me. And basically the idea is this is sort of a question and answer exercise that allows you to learn about a new environment and sort of assess and pull out where the risks in this environment are. So starting here with access, thinking about the environment in terms of what are the access points to the environment. You know, think about your developers, your employees. How do they access resources in your cloud infrastructure? Is there a bastion host or a VPN? You know, do we have API credentials? Anything like that. Think about your customers. How do they gain access to the environment? Is there a front-end website? Do they have credentials we need to be worried about? Moving on to the S here, storage. Think about what types of data exist in the environment. What sort of data is important to you as a business? What's business impacting? Where does that data live? Is it in a storage bucket? Is it in a database? Understanding where that important data lives helps to identify those areas of risk. Thinking about configuration of the environment. How is the environment actually configured? Who manages that? Are you using infrastructure as code like Terraform? Or do you have a DevOps team or an infrastructure team that is responsible for spinning up VMs and databases and configuring storage? Understanding how the environment changes and who manages it, again, is a good way to pull out where risks exist in the environment. Thinking about how data moves through the environment. You know, data often enters the environment, flows around through various systems. Understanding those data flows, again, will pinpoint some areas of risk. And finally, thinking about execution. Where is code running in my environment? Am I pushing code to a build server? Do I have some sort of service like an Azure function, or am I running VMs? Understanding where code runs in the environment, again, is a good way of pinpointing where risks might exist in the environment. And by going through this acronym, asking these questions of various teams, you get a good level, a high level understanding of the environment, how everything operates, how the systems interact, and you can ask some good questions and ultimately identify areas of risk that you can prioritize as part of your detection strategy. Now, as a defender, it's also super important to get familiar with the various sources of signal that are available to us in Azure or in any cloud infrastructure platform. Now, Azure is absolutely notorious for having a ton of services, a ton of data all over the place, and getting to know them can be a challenge. But at Expel, you know, we've gotten familiar with these data sources, and we've broken down the most common data sources that are valuable for detection purposes based on our experience. Notice we have two categories here. We've got, first of all, categories of services, categories of signal that provide security alerts. So services like Azure Identity Protection will alert you when you know, the service believes it's identified compromised credentials or unusual sign-ins, things of that nature. Azure has built-in defender services for various types of resources like databases or storage. And depending on what you're using, these are super valuable and things that you want to turn on to get alert signal. Azure Security Center can surface recommendations and alerts for things like activity happening on your VMs, or unusual configuration changes or vulnerabilities. Super valuable source of signal as a defender. Azure Sentinel is a great SIEM offering as well that can surface up alerts based on whatever sorts of logs you have, including your custom application logs. And finally, Defender for Endpoint, of course, is a super valuable solution that will surface up suspicious behaviors or activity happening on your VMs or on your endpoints. So those are, at a high level, the main sources of alert signal. But at the bottom here, we have a second category, sources of audit log signal. So these are sources of raw audit logs you can use to build your own custom detections based on your unique risks. It's often the case that you'll have an area of risk where there isn't a built-in product, a built-in service that has alerts that gets you detection coverage that you need. So you can use these raw sources of signal, whether that's sign-in log, the directory audit log, activity log, or even diagnostic logs, to build out those custom use cases. Now, as we build out these detection use cases, there's a couple things we want to keep in mind. It's really important to think about quality, right? A noisy or an inaccurate alert can actually do more harm than good. It can cause alert fatigue and make our analysts unhappy. And so as we build detections at Expel, we keep some of these things in mind. For example, we want our detections to be specific. We want to know exactly what happened. We don't want something that's general, like something happened somewhere. We want a very specific indicator. We want something that's resilient, so reliably detects the thing that we actually want to detect. So detecting the behavior, the generic attacker technique, not a very specific indicator that's only going to work for one small situation. We want them to be accurate, relevant, and actionable as well. So keeping these things in mind as we build out our detections is super important. You can apply these criteria to built-in alerts coming from Azure services as well, and it's an opportunity to identify detections and alerting that need some tuning. Now, we've talked at a high level about, again, a mental model for approaching detection, the Ask Me acronym that helps us understand the environment, how to think about building good detections. So let's put this all to practice and show how this can work in a cloud infrastructure environment. So let's imagine we're a security team for a company we'll call Widget-Corp. And our bread and butter is building widgets for our customers. We have backend developers that write widget source code. They push that to build server. Source code is stored in a source code repository, maybe in a storage blob. We have a front-end website that delivers our product to our customers. And behind the scenes, we have a backend database that stores all of our sensitive customer information. So again, let's go back to that Ask Me process and learn a little bit about this environment as a defender to identify areas of risk. Starting with access, let's think about how is access managed this environment? First and foremost, we've got customers that can access the environment through the front-end website. So we want to make sure we're watching out for compromised customer credentials or vulnerabilities in our website. Thinking about how our developers access the environment. They're accessing build servers, they're pushing source code. We want to have detections that are covering that access as well. Again, in thinking about storage, we've got sensitive information in our source code repository, in our customer database. We want to have eyes and alerts and detections covering those areas of risk. And again, configuration, we may have an infrastructure team here that's responsible for configuring our databases, configuring our VMs. We want to make sure that they're making the right configurations that aren't putting us at risk. Movement, data is moving from our developers to our build servers, to our source code repositories, between our customer database and our website. And we want to make sure we have eyes on that as well. And finally, execution, where is code running? We've got code running on our website. We've got code running on our build servers and our developer workstations. And we want to make sure we've got detection coverage of all of those things as well. And so where do we begin? Now, we mentioned, again, there's two different classes of security signal. There's built-in services you can just turn on for Azure that will start to get you some detections. And we recommend starting there. Those built-in Azure tools are a great place to start. That's a great shortcut to get some detection coverage right away. So for our environment, we mentioned we've got sensitive data in our backend database. We've got sensitive data in storage blobs. We want to go ahead and turn on Azure Defender services for both of those Azure services. So we've got some detection coverage out of the box for all those types of commodity threats that may be impacting those types of resources. But again, as we alluded to, there's always going to be situations or risks that are unique to our organization. And so we want to make sure that we're not ignoring those unique risks. and building out our detection strategy to be inclusive of those areas as well. And so we can use a solution like Azure Sentinel for that. We can, for example, build our own custom detections on top of storage diagnostic logs or on top of the Azure activity log to make sure we've got all the detection coverage that we need there. So we've talked about at a high level mental model. We put it to practice to show you how this can work in the real world. Let's talk about a few lessons we've learned at Expel about how to build a effective detection strategy in your cloud infrastructure. First and foremost, don't reinvent the wheel. Again, there are a ton of really great out-of-the-box services you can just turn on and should turn on that will get you good coverage of common areas of risk. Think back to Azure Defender for storage, Azure Defender for SQL, Azure Defender for endpoint. Use those solutions before you go build something custom, before you invest a bunch of time and effort in something else. So you're not wasting a bunch of effort. You're going to get a huge shortcut, a bunch of time saved by leveraging those out-of-the-box services. And again, there's going to be unique areas of risk as well. That's absolutely fine. Using solutions like Azure Sentinel to build your own custom detections is a great way to augment what you get by default from those services. And so what you're seeing on this slide is exactly that in process. You're looking at a subset of our detections in our platform for Azure, and you'll see we do both. We're leveraging the built-in stuff from Azure services, whether that's identity protection or Defender for endpoint, but we also have our own Expel written alerts that are augmenting where we perceive there are any gaps or any areas of opportunity for improving our detection coverage. Our second lesson learned here is we want to start with the high value risk areas. So effective prioritization is really key. And this is something that, again, people get stuck on pretty immediately when they think about defending their cloud infrastructure. There are hundreds and hundreds of services in Azure, and you could spend a whole bunch of time building out detections for each one of those services. But at the end of the day, what you want to prioritize are the things that are most likely to impact you and the things that are most important to your specific business and your unique risk profile. And in our experience, typically most cloud compromises will fall into one of these three buckets, whether that's compromised credentials, compromised hosts, so malware on your virtual machines or your endpoints, or a risky configuration, a misconfiguration of a database, making it public, or a public blob leading to a compromise of data. Those three categories tend to be, the common root causes for most cloud compromises we see. So we'd recommend starting there. And what we've done on this slide is sort of drawn lines between those common risk areas and the built-in services and the audit log sources in Azure that you can use to address those areas of risk. So for example, addressing compromised credentials, you'll want to, for example, start with Azure AD Identity Protection. It does a good job of identifying compromised credentials. And if you need to go further than that for your own areas of risk, you can turn on Defender for Identity or even build your own custom detections on top of the Azure sign-in logs. Similarly, for compromised hosts, you're going to want to start with that built-in service, Defender for Endpoint. It's a great solution for detecting the large majority of threats that are going to impact your endpoints and your servers. So start there. And if you need to build custom detections on top of Windows event logs using Sentinel, you can do that as well. Finally, risky configurations, turning on solutions again like Defender for storage or Defender for SQL. That's going to get you some out-of-the-box detections very quickly. And if you need to build custom stuff on top of that, looking at the Azure activity logs or Azure diagnostic logs to really dial in and build out some very unique use cases for your environment. And to build on that as well, another lesson we've learned at Expel is the story doesn't end in an alert. Producing an alert is really half of the equation. The other half is what happens when that alert shows up, who's looking at it, and do they have the right information to make the right call quickly. And so we've invested a lot of time in this part of the problem at Expel, and we call this decision support. And so what you're seeing here is an example of producing decision support along with an alert that helps our analysts come to the right decision more quickly without having to pivot around to a bunch of different consoles or systems to come to the right conclusion. So for example, when we produce an alert, we'll tell them, okay, well, who is the person that generated this alert? What's their department? What's their role? Things like that, information like that really helps to contextualize the activity we're seeing. It informs the analyst. Similarly, we'll produce historical information like, hey, what does this user normally do in the environment? Is this unusual activity based on historical activity for this user? So that sort of decision support really helps to make that end-to-end process of risk to detection to effective triage flow really smoothly. And that's a great segue to our last lesson learned here. Really can't underscore enough the importance of continuous improvement and measuring and constantly improving based on what you're seeing. And so we're very data-driven at Expel. What you're looking at here is a Datadog dashboard of our detection metrics. We always have eyes on this, and this informs, for example, is the threat landscape changing? Is something changing with the data we're getting? Do we have a new risk that's emerging? Do we have some sort of false positive scenario? Understanding what's going on and what you need to do to adjust based on the changes in the environment. Super, super important. Again, detection is not a one and done process. It's a continuous cycle of improvement. And with that, we'll stop here and see if we have any questions. Happy to answer any questions. Feel free to drop them in our Q&A. We'll review them, try to get to them. And if we don't, we have all this stuff recorded and we'll reach back out and make sure we get answers for everyone. Let's see here. Not seeing any questions come in. Okay, no questions. All right, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in and stay tuned for the rest of our detection day. Cheers, thanks.